So a lot of times, players that come up, and we've been talking about, with Adam's latest Gray Owl session and that kind of stuff, how to develop characters that feel like they live in a world, characters that have, meaningful backstories and how that plays in. But, I've been running a few games myself lately, and one of the things that I noticed is that players developed organic relationships when they were very interested in each other, and when other players would be open to answering those things. It doesn't mean that when a player says, "Oh, what's your thing?" you have to be like, "Well, here's my 10-page backstory and let me read," and it doesn't mean you have to give away every secret. But one of the things that I noticed is that a lot of times the characters that seemed less engaging to both my players and me as a DM are the ones where it's like, "Oh, so hey, where do you come from? You wouldn't understand." And then they just like look out a window. And that's all you get, There's no connection, Whereas if it's the opposite, where let's say, this is my player character, I'm the DM. PC asks this player like, "Oh, how did you learn magic?" And they're like, "You wouldn't understand." But then I have an NPC as a as a DM, and I get into a one-on-one conversation with them, and then that one-on-one conversation leads to that player leaking a backstory secret. It's also less satisfying because it's establishing a connection between the player and the DM, not a player and a player. So a really good example of this that happened in my Geras game, which is one that I reference a lot, is I had this scene where I noticed, based on the chat log, because I had the benefit of documentation, that in one of my latest sessions, Gowron, the sorcerer, was like really being kind of more than usually protective of another PC I had, which was a warlock, and not like in a weird way or a creepy way. It was just that they would notice like, "Oh, you're upset. Is there anything I can get for you?" Which I'm sure as a character they would do that anyway, but it just so happened that in this session, in this moment, my warlock had more of an emotional need than the rogue and the barbarian. So Gowron the sorcerer addressed that need, and I was like, well, this is a really interesting dynamic that they've set up now. It's like, "Do you need anything?" And then they put a blanket over them and they're like, "Thanks, I appreciate it." That now is establishing an organic connection. Now, how as a DM can set up an environment that makes it so we can learn a little bit more about Gowron, and we can learn a little bit more about Warlock, So the idea being, oh, this is a unique pairing that we haven't seen before, And a lot of times I've been listening to the Office Ladies podcast, which doesn't sound like a D&D thing, but a lot of times what they talk about is the writing process. And really, what is D&D? But one big like writing exercise and one big performative exercise. And the writers would talk about, a lot of times when they were writing an episode, they would look at two characters that haven't really gotten a one-on-one interaction. And they would see what that interaction would look like to put them together. So in this particular session, the warlock had like a drive to find obscure knowledge, right? They're like, I need to learn more about this subject, but the mainstream libraries don't have anything on it because this is potentially dangerous knowledge. It's potentially forbidden knowledge. Gowron the sorcerer is like, I come from a library. I come from an academy that just so happens to have archives of forbidden magic, right? So not only do we get to learn more about the warlock character, because their drive is to find forbidden knowledge about where their warlock powers come from, we get to now learn about Gowron because we're going to go visit his origin story a little bit, So to me, now as a DM, I'm not invested in Gowron's story and I'm not invested in the warlock story. I'm invested in the connection between the two of them, and what that would look like and how that might strengthen the party's bonds, So, when we played out this scene, it was really fascinating because even though the front story, like Ian talks about, is finding the forbidden knowledge or whatever, what I got to do was I start to tease parts of like oh, by the way, Gowron's magic is a little weird. Why might that be? And start to like let the warlock see where Gowron got Gowron's magic through her own discovery, you know? So now it's like, whoa, Gowron, I just discovered this artifact. And he's like, yeah, this is the artifact that gave me my weird magic. And now she's like, oh, well, what does that weird magic feel like? And now Gowron can open up a little bit more about specific details about how he views the world. And now, kind of like what Adam says, as players, not as characters, but as players watching this scene unfold, we now get to empathize with his character a little bit more. We now get to understand his motivations, how he looks at the world. And the characters care more about each other, you know? And I think that's, Adam's been talking about it with Grey Owl's book too, but this was like a specific technique that I just happened to recognize and wanted to share, which is a lot of times players are really excited about having secrets, but the only value of a secret is in its reveal, right? And the best way to reveal it is through another player actively discovering it, right? Rather than it being spilled out by circumstance, you know? One of the other things that I make sure to really include in my games, and I'm not sure if it's been recognized so much by my players as an intentional structural design decision, not a storytelling decision, is pretty much most of the games that I run in Geras have what's called a train scene, where basically everyone sits on the train and gets to talk to each other. You know, the purpose of this is to give players the opportunity to create their own organic connections by being interested in each other, you know? And the idea being that a lot of times characters haven't adventured with each other. They're meeting each other for the first time, and the company has just decided to hire these random adventurers because their abilities will work well together given what the mission is, but they don't know each other personally. From a metagame perspective, that company is me. I'm looking at which players will have interesting interactions, which player characters are going to form organic connections. What will that ultimately look like, you know? And so the purpose of these train scenes is also really just to demonstrate the most important aspect of having an immersive scene like this is patience. I'm not driving the story forward. I'm not asking the players what they would like to do. I just say, players, do what you talk to each other however you want. When you're ready to move on, just tell me you're ready to move on. And oftentimes these train scenes, like in a 5-hour session, they take about an hour and a half, 2 hours. And that's before the quest is introduced, right? And the rest of it is pretty boilerplate procedural. It's talk to the quest giver, figure out the quest, go to the quest, fight the thing, figure out the denouement, you know? That part is actually the easy part, right? Because that's the part I planned out. I can't plan out organic interactions, but I can practice a disciplined process of figuring out what's going to encourage those interactions. And I find that setting up an environment that makes it easy for player characters to inquire other player characters about their backstories is the most immersive way to do that.
Thank you so much for listening to some of our podcast highlights. This podcast is part of the Darkmoor Podcast Network. If you want to support the content creators, feel free to visit our Patreon. And please, game responsibly.